Let's remember that the human species has 23 chromosomes, 21 of which are autosomal. Two of which are sex chromosomes. When we're looking at the sex chromosome, there's a difference in how the sex chromosome is inherited versus the autosomal chromosomes. So, as we've learned already, whenever we create haploid cells, those are your gametes, through meiosis, you take and you create cells that have half the DNA. So instead of having two copies of each gene, the haploid only has one copy of each gene. For instance, A on chromosome 1, and maybe B on chromosome 2, and maybe C on chromosome 3, and D on chromosome 4. And that goes for the male cell, the sperm. The female then would give its one copy of the genes that it has. So it might be A and or B and C and D. So when we create our gametes, we're going to have two copies of each gene, one from each parent. And I know most of you understand this already. And in fact, I'm pretty sure all of you do. There's a difference, though, with sex chromosomes. And we've discussed this already when we covered meiosis and mitosis. However, it's appropriate, I think, here to remind you about the difference between the inheritance of sex chromosomes and autosomal chromosomes. And that's that when you're inheriting sex chromosomes, the male of the species only gets one copy of the genes on the X chromosome. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, if you have a father, X, Y, and you have a mom, X, X, if they do the cross, if we do a cross, the females are going to have two copies of each X chromosome, one from dad and one from mom, the way all the other genes are inherited. Here you're going to have two copies of each of the genes. So you can have a big A and a little a, you can have a big A and big A, and or you can have a little a and a little a. Well, not and or, right? So you can have one of these combinations in these two because you have two X chromosomes, one from dad and one from mom. But with the males, you're only going to get one of the chromosomes. You're only going to get one copy of the X, and that's always going to be from mom. So mom has a much bigger influence on the boys, on the male of the species, because mom is going to give the only copy of the genes that are on the X chromosome to the males, where the females have two copies, one from dad and one from mom. Now, when we're talking about the male of the species, instead of having those two copies, you only have one copy. And it's only going to be the whatever mom has. So if mom has a big A, then that's all the males have. If mom has a little a, then that's all the males have. There's no second copy the way we've dealt with dominant and recessives throughout the year. So when you're considering X chromosome genes, you have to consider that the males only have one copy. Well, there's a consequence to that, and let's take a look at what that consequence is going to be. Let's assume for a minute that mom, color blindness. Let's take a look at color blindness. Color blindness is found on the X chromosome. And let's assume that mom has the trait for color blindness, but not color blindness, color blindness itself, where dad is colorblind. So here's the male of of the cross. He has color blindness, and she, the mom, has the trait, but is not herself colorblind. Well, because dad has this small c, the recessive allele, and mom has a small c, 1/4 of the population has a chance. One quarter of their progeny have the chance. You have a 1/4 chance of getting being colorblind and being a female. So you can have a colorblind female. That's how you could get it. The way you get a colorblind female in our species is the father was colorblind and the mom had the trait or had colorblindness herself. So the male also has color blindness, but please pay attention. There's only one small c here, where here you have two. It's still recessive, but you notice that there's no dominant, and that's why the recessive gene shows up. In this crossing, there's going to be 1/4 of the progeny that are going to be they're going to be carriers. They're not going to be colorblind, but they're going to have the trait, the allele, because dad is going to give that X, and his X he only has one X to give, and that one has color blindness on it. Where 1/4 of the progeny, or half the males, are not going to be colorblind because they only have the dominant. Remember, they only have one copy of the gene each, and in this case, you have 50% of the males have color blindness, and 50% of the females have color blindness. So you have a 50, and you have 50% of the total population with color blindness, while the other 50% doesn't. So that pattern, those results would not be expected if you're talking about an autosomal gene, because you'd have a second copy of the gene. You'd end up, if you were crossing, for instance, two heterozygotes, if dad was a heterozygote as well, you'd expect 1/4, and then half the population having the heterozygous trait. We'd have 1/4 being homozygous dominant, the other homozygous recessive, and then half of them showing the dominant trait but being heterozygote. So the percentages are different, and there's also another consequence, and that's that what you're going to end up, and I think you can imagine that you'd end up having the males more often get the trait that's recessive if it's on the X chromosome. And let me show you, I think, a better example of what I'm saying, what I'm talking about here. If we take a look at this cross, where you have a male that's not colorblind and a female that is, you'll note that 0% of the females are going to have color blindness, because the male is going to give them the dominant trait. And again, just like any other allele in the rest of the 23 chromosomes, these two, the female has two copies of each of the genes, and if it has a dominant allele, then the recessive is hidden. But in the male, you have the recessive trait, only one copy, and they're both colorblind. 100% of the males are going to be colorblind in this cross. We're 0% of the females, and the males have the disease even though they only have one copy of the recessive gene, because there's no other version of the gene to hide the gene product that's produced by the recessive allele. So in other words, no matter what happens, you tend to have, with X-linked traits, you tend to have more males having the disease or the trait than females. All right, so now let's take a look at the quiz here. So again, pretty much everything we talked about over here is listed here. And what you'll see here is that this is a version of a cross where you have a homozygous dominant female and a recessive male. So this person, for instance, would be colorblind, where this person would not be colorblind, if N meant colorblindness. And so what you end up getting is you get the females, which would be here, double X, nobody getting color blindness, but because the female had the dominant trait, none of the males have it either, but the females are carriers. The males can't carry, and that's another thing about X-linked traits. Males can't carry the trait. If they have the trait, they express it because they only have one copy of the gene on the X chromosome. Now you take a look at this cross where you have a heterozygote female. Again, the female can be heterozygote. The male can't be because the male only has one copy of all the genes on the X chromosome. So the male has a big N. The female is heterozygote. Let's look at what happens. Because the male has a dominant trait, a dominant version of the gene, none of the females can have the trait. So only the males can have it. In this case, 1/4 of the males have it. Now, if the male had the allele, and the female were heterozygote, then it would be possible. Then what you would get is you would get half the females would have it and half the males would have it. So here you get half and half, 50%. Here only the males have it, and here no one has it. And of course you saw what would happen in this situation where in this situation where you have if the female had the disease or the trait and was homozygous recessive, and the male had the dominant version, then none of the females would get it, and all the males would have it, because again, the males only get one copy of the gene. All right, so I hope that you understand X-linked traits. They're just traits or genes that are found on the X chromosome. But because males only get one X chromosome, the results are that the genetics of the situation is such that the males tend to show the recessive trait more often. It's also true that males can't be carriers, and females are the only the female X chromosome determines what genes the male gets, because only the female gives X genes to the male of our species. All right, so go ahead and read the rest of this, and I hope you get it, you understand it. I'm not going to answer these in these videos. I'm just going to try to explain the background. I hope I did a good job. If not, let me know. We'll try it again.